All right. Um, Good morning, everyone. As you know, today is day one of the reading challenge, and so I've got my little clock here with me. Basically, I'm going to be taking on the challenge of reading online for 15 minutes a day. Okay, for 50 days. That's the challenge. Today, I'll be reading from Day-to-Day Economics, which is written by Satish Deodhar. Okay, and he's a part of the IIM. It's one of the IIM recommended books. So IIM Ahmedabad business books. Okay, with that it's showing 9:15 on the clock. Let's see how this goes. Sorry, 9:30 on the clock. You'll probably see it the other way around. Okay, here goes. Here we go. Chapter 2: Budgets, Deficits, and Taxation. And there's a quote which says, "The state collects tax for the greater welfare of its citizens, in the same way as the sun evaporates water, only to return it manifold in the form of rain." This was written by Kalidhas. I think it's Raghuvansha and circa 4 CE. I'm not sure what that means, but that's what it says. Okay. What is the origin of the budget? In the last chapter, we discussed the role of the government plays in several economic activities. The scope of the government is quite broad, from establishing and running the judiciary and law and order, through undertaking activities where markets fail due to public goods and natural monopolies, to interference in activities that involve externalities and policy measures. The government I'll repeat that. The government needs finance to support all these economic activities. Good housekeeping, whether at a household level or at a government level, requires one to maintain and present a statement of expenditures and revenues for the year gone by, and draw up an estimate for the new year. The preparation of such an expenditure and revenue statement by the government took a formal shape in England by the middle of the 18th century and used to be presented by the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the House of Commons in India. It was the finance minister who presented the Union budget in Parliament on the last working day of February. Every year, a few days before and after the budget, there is a flurry of new articles and discussions in newspapers and electronic media. The budget gets discussed as if it were a cricket World Cup final. Many economic terms, which of course we are supposed to know, are thrown at us by the experts. What we are going to attempt to do here is answer the simple queries and some pertinent questions which somehow may be due to a lack of time never get clarified. Essentially, we will try to explain in brief and help you understand the process followed by the government for preparing the budget, the size of the budget, how the budget expenditure is finalized, and whether the budget deficits are bad for the country, and what there is in the budget that one should be aware of. We take up these issues below. Timing, process, and size. While the Indian government, for all its civil and administrative purposes, follows the Gregorian calendar that begins in January 1st, it mandates different 12-month period called the fiscal year for taxation, budget, and financial reporting by the private sector. The fiscal year begins on April 1st and ends on March 31st. The government has to operationalize the budget from April 1st. However, before that happens, it has to get the budget approval from Parliament. This entails discussions in the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, for which the government has to allot sufficient time. And therefore, the Finance Minister presents the budget on the last working day of February. Although the railway budget is presented separately, the consolidated two amounts do form part of the general budget presented by the Finance Minister. I'm sorry, I lost track of that. Do form part of by the Finance Minister, whose speech in Parliament consists of two parts. Part A, the Minister represents the economic survey of the fiscal year gone by. This is the Ministry's view of the annual economic development of the country, and it forms the backdrop of the presentation of the budget for the fiscal year and Part B of the speech. One can access the economic survey and the budget documents at the Government of India's website, in other words, which is at http://indiabudget.nic.in. Along with other terms presented in the budget document, the Finance Minister submits the annual financial statement, which consists of estimated receipts and spending, which are operated through three separate accounts. First is the consolidated fund, second is the contingency fund, and the third is the public account. All revenues and loans raised and recovered form part of the consolidated fund, of which no amount can be spent without the approval of Parliament. The contingency fund is an impressed amount that is available to the President of India to meet unforeseen expectations and expenditures, such as the expenditure to tackle natural disasters and accidents. Post facto approval of such expenditure is sought from Parliament, and an equivalent amount is drawn from the consolidated fund. The current corpus of this contingency fund is rupees 500 crores. And then there is the public account, which holds amounts which are held by the government in trust. These include items such as employee provident fund and small savings accounts collections. The funds in these items do not belong to the government and have to be eventually returned to the people who deposited them. No parliamentary approval is needed for such payments, except when the amounts are withdrawn from the consolidated fund and kept in the public account for specific expenditures. For example, the road construction. So, what is the size of the budget? One can address this issue in the absolute terms as well as in relation to the nation's income. If one looks at the absolute numbers, the total budget expenditure of the Union government for the fiscal year 2010-2011 was just over rupees 11,000 crores. 1100, sorry, I'll repeat that, was just over rupees 1100, that's 1100,000 crores, which is approximately which is approximately $246 billion. If we measure the size of the budget in terms of tax and non-tax revenue receipts generated by the government, this amount is just rupees 682,000 crores, or about $152 billion. One might be led to wonder whether this size is large or small compared to the size of the economy. One popular and useful measure for the size of the economy is called the gross domestic product. When we express the size of the budget as a percentage of the size of the economy, that tells us how big or small government participation is in the economy. For the fiscal year 2010-2011, the total budget, expenditure, and tax, non-tax, and other revenue receipts accounted for 14% or 9.5% of India's GDP respectively. How does this relative size of the budget compare to the relative size of other countries? It turns out that the government's relative size and budget, and hence size of the government's participation in the economy, is rather small when compared to the relative size of other countries. For example, as reported by the World Development Report in 1998-99, the tax revenue expressed as a percentage of GDP for India, and that is the central government, was about 10%, while for the other countries such as France and UK, it was about 39% and 34% respectively. The relative size is quite high, even for other comparable countries such as Brazil, and which is at 20%, and Russia, which is at 17%. Now we'll read on expenditure, revenue, and deficit. Types of revenue. In the last chapter, we defined the various reasons why the government undertakes certain activities and intervenes in the market. All the expenditures incurred on the functioning of the judiciary, maintaining law and order, routine administration, salaries, subsidies, pensions for administrative staff, and for the payment of debts are classified as revenue expenditures. Essentially, these are expenditures that do not lead to the creation of assets and are used up for the normal functioning of the government. Capital expenditures, on the other hand, include asset creating expenditures for providing public goods such as dams, bridges, roads, plants, and machinery built for the use of government sector. If the government expenditure forms one side of the union budget, the government receipts form the other. The government receipts are classified into revenue receipts and capital receipts. Revenue receipts include tax receipts and non-tax receipts, such as stamp duties, fees, dividends, if any, for the public sector undertaking, or PSUs. Capital receipts, on the other hand, include grants received and loans recovered by the government and occasional disinvestment procedures earned for selling PSUs. These are called non-debt capital receipts. So we are 10 minutes, I've got 5 more minutes to go. Here we go. However, despite the collection of revenue receipts and non-debt capital receipts, the government may still fall short of financing for its expenditures. In fact, the low tax and non-tax revenue receipts as a percentage of the GDP does not really mean the government's interference on the economy is low. It could mean the government is inefficient in collecting sufficient revenue in relation to expenditures. As pointed out earlier, the Union government expenditure in the fiscal year 2010-2011 was higher than the tax and the non-tax revenue receipts by over rupees 400,000 crores. Generally, the non-debt capital receipts are low, and this means that the government has to borrow to recover the deficit amount. Therefore, borrowing a capital receipt, albeit the debt creating capital receipt, the government has three choices. Therefore, borrowing is a capital receipt, albeit a debt creating receipt. The government has three choices for generating debt capital receipts. Borrowing domestically from the public is the first one. Borrowing from external financial institutions, that's the second one. And third is borrowing from the central bank of the country. These three forms of borrowing are undertaken by selling new government securities and bonds. Based on the types of budget expenditures and revenues as defined above, economists consider three kinds of deficits for measuring the prudent handling of government finances. The first of the revenue deficit, which measures the difference between the revenue expenditure and the revenue receipts. Read that properly. The first is the revenue deficit, which measures the difference between the revenue expenditure and the revenue receipts. A deficit of this kind shows the management of the government finances in poor light. For it shows that the government has to borrow money to finance administrative activities, which is not leading to the creation of assets. This is akin to the household that needs to borrow funds to pay for servants or housemaids or a driver or a gardener. For of course, if a household borrows to invest in a child's higher education, the borrowing is for an expenditure which will create an asset in the form of human capital, and such borrowing will always be preferred. So I've got 1 minute, so I'll read one more paragraph. The second type of deficit, that is the fiscal deficit, which refers to the difference between the government's total expenditure and the total non-debt receipts. In short, this indicates that the government is exhausted of options for financing its expenditure, and the only recourse left is to borrow. Thus, fiscal deficit shows that the total debt guaranteed by the government to finance the total budget expenditure. Such a deficit is justified as long as the expenditures are being incurred to finance activities leading to the creation of national assets. High fiscal deficits become a matter of worry, for if incurred year after year, they cumulatively create a huge debt on the government. The recent experience of Greece and other European countries show that the cumulative fiscal deficits can lead to countries to bankruptcy of the government. Oh my goodness. So that's the end of day 1. Okay. I hope you have a nice day. I hope I'm able to continue this and focus and build on it. With that, thank you very much for watching, and over to seeing you tomorrow for day 2 of the reading challenge. This is Russell Brown. Have a nice day.